There are two main ways of categorizing personality tests into either objective tests or projective tests. Okay, objective tests are those that are not open to interpretation. There is a clearly defined scoring sheet. Okay, how this is going to be measured is clearly designed beforehand. Okay, usually it will be numerical in the results. So an objective test allows us quite often, it can be T data and L data like we looked at, but most of the time it's Q data, usually self-reports, S data. It can allow us to ask a large number of questions in order to gain a general evaluation. Remember, we want to know how do people behave, not just in one context, but at work, at school, with friends, with family, with strangers. What's their average behavior like, okay? Which is called the aggregation, okay? When we're working out their average personality across contexts. Now, these type of tests allow us easily to test for reliability and validity, right? The things we looked at the end of last session. If it's a questionnaire, I can check for internal consistency. Okay, I can give them the questionnaire again a month later, or the experiment again a month later if it's T data, and I can check for stability, right? I can also give questionnaires to friends and family to check for inter-rater consistency. So reliability is generally easy to test. And validity too, you know, I can check that it is showing discriminative validity when comparing it to questionnaires designed to measure something else. I can see if it has predictive validity. Is it predicting differences on tasks if it's a questionnaire that we're using? So generally, reliability and validity are easy to test using objective tests. The weaknesses will be the weaknesses we already spoke about when we spoke about the different types of data, but since it's mostly questionnaires, the obvious limitation is social desirability. Okay, that's the main drawback with these types of tests, that we're counting on the individual, the participant, to answer honestly. I'm sure you've came across such objective tests before, such as the Big Five, but one common example is the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory, the most widely used personality assessment in the US. It consists of 567 true or false questions. I'm easily embarrassed. I believe I'm being followed. I believe people are out to get me. I believe I would be further ahead if people weren't holding me back. A whole range of questions that check for multiple personality traits and for certain mental psychopathologies, certain mood disorders, anxiety, and so on. It's a large pool of questions, okay? But the benefit of this is that you can check that people are answering consistently and honestly, that they're paying attention. So, for example, you can have two questions that are basically the exact same. You can have one question that is, I'm easily embarrassed, and then maybe 50 questions later, one that says, I'm not easily embarrassed, okay? The exact same that's just flipped. Obviously, if a person is paying attention, answering consistently and honestly, then they should answer true to the first one, false to the second one, or vice versa, right? It should be consistent. Otherwise, maybe this person isn't actually paying attention or answering honestly. Maybe the results can't be trusted, perhaps. We have to classify them as invalid. These types of assessments, this one in particular is quite popular with hiring positions, particularly for quite high security risk positions. Like I say, you can screen out particular personality traits that might not be desirable for the position. But also, if the person isn't paying attention, then maybe this isn't really the person for this task. If it's something that requires a lot of attention, if they can't actually, you know, keep concentrated on a questionnaire with about 600 questions. Now, what we found in these types of questionnaires, really any type of personality questionnaire, whether it's the Minnesota Multifaceted Inventory or the Big Five or Isaac's personality questionnaire, the results always form a normal distribution, okay, which is quite common in things we measure in people, you know, height and weights and so on is the same. But a lot of the things we measure in psychology form a normal distribution if there is enough participants, okay? Meaning that it's like a bell curve when we look at all the scores, right? Most people are near the middle, only very few people are at the extreme edges. And we can, knowing that it's a normal distribution, we can use, for example, if we have the percentile of where they are, then we can visualize where they are. And also the standard deviations can help us because if a normal distribution occurs, it looks like this. Obviously most people are in the middle, so this would be 50 percentile. So if it's an extroversion questionnaire, for example, and the person scores 50 percentile, obviously they're more extroverted than 50% of the population, less extroverted than 50%. But the standard deviation is the average distance from the average, right? And we know in a normal distribution, more than 95% are within 2 standard deviations of the average, okay? So only 2% of people are more than 2 standard deviations above the mean, and only 2% of people are more than 2 standard deviations below the mean, okay? So again, this is what we form in pretty much all personality assessments, okay, so long as there is enough participants. And so this allows us really to clearly visualize where a participant falls on the distribution, so long as we know, for example, their percentile. But can participants really answer these sorts of tests honestly? I talked about the Minnesota Multifaceted Personality Inventory being used for certain positions, for hiring processes. Do people actually answer honestly in these sorts of scenarios? Maybe you've done some personality questionnaire before as part of a job recruitment. Were you answering how it relates to you, or were you answering what do they want to hear? So obviously social desirability is always going to be an issue, but also there is an issue that maybe people can't actually be objective about themselves. Okay, maybe they're going to answer incorrectly, not deliberately, but just because they don't have a good self-image of themselves and can't actually objectively answer these questions. So Nisbet and Wilson in 77 summed up in a good paper all of the kind of issues that might affect people's objectivity when it comes to assessing themselves, and they had some experiments to demonstrate this. And so, one potential factor that might impact results and stop people from being objective is ordering effects. So, for example, in one of Nisbet and Wilson's studies, they had 5 identical socks, and then they asked a whole bunch of participants which one's their favorites, and the majority of them picked out the first one, okay? And then if they were asked, why did you pick this one? They would give some explanation, okay? They would say, well, it looks like it's more expensive material than the others, or it looks slightly nicer than the others, even though the 5 socks are actually identical, okay? So they're coming up with explanations that they think are rational, okay? But we quite often make post hoc explanations to rationalize our behavior. But of course, that isn't the reason, okay? It can't be the reason, because these 5 socks are identical. There's an ordering effect occurring, and the people aren't aware of what's swaying their results, okay? They still think they're being objective. We can be vulnerable to unconscious cues or subliminal messaging. Okay, so in another study in the text, participants were all asked what's their favorite detergent. Some of the participants earlier had been exposed to words to do with tides, so moon, ocean, for example. And these participants were significantly more likely to rate Tide detergent as their favorite detergent. Again, when asked why that's your favorite, they weren't saying because of these words they read earlier. They were saying because it's their favorite detergent, because it's the one that gets the most stains out or whatever. They were coming up with an explanation. Okay, again, they weren't aware of what was swaying their results. Recent events in memory. So maybe you're doing a personality questionnaire. One of the items is, are you a compassionate person? And earlier that day you gave to charity or gave change to the homeless or did something such as that. That's going to tilt you towards thinking you're pretty compassionate, right? But maybe that's not what you do every day. And so maybe you would have answered differently on a different day. And who are you comparing yourself to? If you're answering questions such as that, what you're thinking about is, am I compassionate in comparison to the other people I know? Am I, the typical level of compassion, or am I more compassionate or less compassionate? That's obviously going to be influenced by who's in your environment, right? On one extreme end, are you, surrounded by Buddhist monks, or on the other extreme, are you, surrounded by violence? Most of us are going to be somewhere in the middle of that range, but we're going to be answering these questions using who's in our lives as kind of benchmarks when answering these sorts of questions. So who we're comparing ourselves to obviously will impact our results. And again, we won't be fully aware over the extent of that. So what's some potential issues we can, or solutions rather, that we can use to deal with social desirability? First of all, we can make our questionnaires, if it's part of research, anonymous. Okay, that will lessen the chances of people wanting to answer in a particular way, increase the chances of them being honest. We can have a question, have you ever lied? Okay, most people at some point in their life have told at least some white lie. Okay, so if someone answers that question, no, never, absolutely not, never lied in my whole life, then maybe we would be skeptical over that person's results. If they haven't answered that question seemingly honestly, then maybe they haven't answered the other questions honestly. Reverse scored items are like what I told you before. I am embarrassed, I am not embarrassed. Okay, questions that are the exact same, just in reverse, making sure that the participant has answered consistently. Catch items are questions such as answer neutral to this question. Okay, so it's not actually a question, it's just checking that the participant is actually reading the questions and not just, A, B, C, and just randomly filling out options. Okay, so if the question is respond, agree to this, and they respond, disagree, then obviously they haven't read the question, and so we might classify the results of that participant as invalid. And then we can check that the data is validated by other measurements. Okay, so L data and T data, the other measurements that we looked at last time. Any questions on anything there? Projective tests, on the other hand, are then those that are open to interpretation. Okay, the interpretation of the researcher or the clinician, whoever is conducting the test. Usually these give some sort of ambiguous stimuli to the participants, hoping that they'll project their thoughts onto their report of what they see. Okay, that they'll project something of their mental state or any issues or their personality. And this can be very rich. It can give us insights that we maybe wouldn't pick up on a objective test, particularly if it's something very niche and specific to the person, right? That maybe you wouldn't think to ask about in a general questionnaire that's going to people universally. So it can give you more kind of exact information maybe about a particular person. But obviously it's difficult to establish norms, okay? In a questionnaire, we know what the norm is, we know what the average is for IQ or for extroversion and so on, and we know where people fall on the distribution, okay? So we know if they're extreme or if they're typical, okay? It's much more difficult to determine what's a typical and atypical response on a projective test, okay? There's no norm for what should be said and then what would indicate this particular mental illness, for example. And so it's open, obviously, to the interpretation of the researcher or clinician. It's pretty poor in reliability and validity. So what I mean by this is, if it's the same participant who gives the same response to multiple raters, they quite often will come up with different interpretations, okay? They're not necessarily in agreement with each other, which wouldn't be good reliability. And then there's less evidence that these sorts of tests can predict differences in outcomes in the way that questionnaires can, okay? So that would question the validity. Nevertheless, there are proponents of these that argue that these sorts of tests can be at least somewhat standardized. The best example is the Exeter scoring sheet for the Roche-Bock ink blot test. Okay, I'll come back onto the Roche-Bock ink blot test, but you've probably heard of it. It's, you know, an ink blot. What do you see? The person gives some response. The Exeter scoring system looks for keywords that the participants might give in their responses. Okay, and the scoring sheet says these keywords might indicate this. So there are some proponents of such tests. Okay, to give you an example of a projective test, don't look ahead at the future slides. Just do what it tells you here, either on a sheet of paper if you have one, or on your tablets or laptops if you draw a page however you like, and then we'll dissect what that means in about 5 minutes. And so, according to the person who came up with this test, they said these are some of the things that it could reveal. And if it's to the top of the paper, you're typically more positive and optimistic. You're more realist if you've drawn your pig in about the middle of the paper. You're more pessimistic, prone to negativity if you've done at the bottom of the page. If you've done your pig facing left, you typically believe in tradition and being friendly and you remember dates well. If you have it facing right, you're more active, prone to forgetting dates, innovative, strong sense of family. If you've done it forward facing, more direct, more prone to neither fearing nor avoiding confrontation. If you've done many details, more analytical, but maybe more prone to caution. Fewer details, more emotional, more of a risk taker. Less than 4 legs might indicate your major period of change. With 4 legs showing a tendency to be secure and stick to your ideals. With large ears, a good listener, long tail, and guess how sexual you are. So obviously this test isn't really to be taken very seriously. And you can think to yourself, was any of this true? Say the person who came up with this test, their predictions, did anything ring true for you and how you do your pig or not? But overall, I get an example of you know, how this is very much open to kind of interpretation. Another example, one that's got a bit more respect to it, is the Roche-Bock ink blot test. The most famous example of a projective test. Developed by Swiss psychiatrists in 1921 by Hermann Roche-Bock. You've probably seen it before. I'm going to give you an example on the next slide. But you know, an ink blot is given to the participant or the patient, and then they're just asked, what do you see? Hoping that they'll project something about their issues or personality in their reports. It's the second most frequently reported test in clinical practices in the US, following only the Minnesota multifaceted personality inventory. But I should say the US is a bit of an outlier on this. Okay, the rest of the world typically doesn't really put as much endorsement into the Roche-Bock ink blot test, as some psychologists still do in the US. So one example of an ink blot. So, you know, pretend you're in the research scenario or in your session. You know, you're just being presented with this. You're asked, what do you see? You're not allowed to think about it. You just report immediately what's the first thing that comes to mind. You're not supposed to screen out your unconscious coming to the surface. So what's the first kind of thing that screams out to you? A butterfly? An angel? Anything else? A beetle, a bat, a bird? Wolves?
Ribs, like a ribcage.
Okay, ribcage, yeah. Okay, so someone said butterfly, but they didn't say a dying butterfly. According to the Exeter scoring system, if someone says a dying or tattered butterfly, they might have some fascination with death or some fixation on death. Now, you probably wouldn't put too much into one report, okay? But you're showing them multiple ink blots, and maybe you're seeing that the recurring pattern is revealing some sort of fixation. But obviously open to interpretation. And of course, what you're viewing here might be, again, influenced by what you've just been exposed to recently. You know, maybe you were watching a movie last night about people motorcycling, and then maybe you would see two men riding motorcycles. You know, you could easily be influenced by something that you've just recently seen that then might kind of throw up the results. And of course, that's not revealing anything deep about you. It's just kind of indicating what you've recently watched. Okay, another example is the thematic appreciation test, theory, by Murray and Morgan in the 30s in Harvard University. Similar, but instead of an ink blot, the participants are given a scene, an ambiguous scene, and then they're told to kind of tell a short story or a narrative. What do you see when looking at this picture? Again, you're not probably going to put too much into one response, okay? But the person reveals responses to 19 cards in the test that show 19 cards, and maybe a recurring pattern emerges across all of these cards that then you might want to probe further into. So here's an example of one of the cards. So again, pretend you've just been shown this ambiguous scene. What's the first kind of thing that comes to mind? What do you think is happening here? Anyone? I can hear you telling answers, but no one wants to voice it. What do you think? What do you see? Yeah.
That looks like he just like discovered her dad.
Okay, so he's just discovered her dead. Yeah. Anything else? Is that what you also? Did anyone see something different? Okay, well, I mean, usually I get a mix of responses. You know, maybe it's someone caring for a sick loved one, and they're feeling overwhelmed, or maybe like someone said, someone who's just passed away. Or you know, students sometimes have said people who are really hungover, so you know, that might reveal something. But anyway, the idea here is, again, you're not putting too much into one response, but maybe across multiple cards, the person reveals something about you know, having lost a loved one that they might then, you know, be wanting to talk more about, or maybe they are constantly feeling like a burden, or someone is constantly caring for them. Again, maybe that's a theme that will emerge. So the idea here is that you don't put any focus on one card result, that a theme that emerges. And I should say, a lot of psychologists who use these tests, the TAT and the ink blot test, they typically nowadays use it as a kind of icebreaker or conversation starter, something to kind of start the session off with. They don't really use it anymore for like diagnoses, okay? So it's more of a kind of icebreaker.